so we've given a couple minutes for stragglers to come straggling in, so I think we're just going to get started. Hello to everyone. If you have not seen or heard from me before, my name is Kirsten. I work for the Conservancy, obviously. I'm one of the education program coordinators and one of the coordinators for this particular ExperTalk series. I also have Kenny, who is somewhere in here. He's doing a lot of the back end stuff, checking people in and making sure Zoom does not crash and ruin everything. Thank you for being here today. We're really excited about this because it's ongoing current research about how shorebirds are using restored shoreline habitat in Upper Newport Bay. We have Maddy Panzino, who did her undergraduate research on this at Cal State Fullerton. And like I said, this is just a subset of the research. So what she saw will obviously have promising returns for future research. So Maddy, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kirsten. Like she said, my name is Maddy Panzino, and I did this research for my undergrad at Cal State Fullerton through a program called SCERP, which is the Southern California Ecosystems Research Program. And so, yeah, I investigated shorebird use on restored living shoreline habitat in Newport Bay, California. I also did this research with PIs Dr. Hoese and Dr. Zacherl. So first thing I want to talk about is what is a living shoreline. This picture here is not a living shoreline. This is kind of like the conventional method used to prevent coastline erosion. It's basically putting up a retaining wall or some riprap, which is just like rocks brought in by people. And it does the job of preventing coastline erosion and dissipating that wave energy. But it also has like low habitat value, and it's damaging to intertidal zones because there's like an abrupt segregation between the subtidal and intertidal habitats. And it's also sometimes expensive to install and to upkeep or to maintain. So the alternative to this conventional method is a living shoreline, which is kind of like an example shown right here. They do the same job, like preventing coastline erosion and absorbing wave energy, but it also provides more habitat for the subtidal and intertidal communities. And they've also been used to combat effects of climate change in areas affected by like sea level rise or hurricanes. And in a living shoreline, you can use species like eelgrass, cordgrass, mussel beds, oyster beds, stuff like that. So now specifically in Newport Bay, the living shoreline there is an assemblage of the native Olympia oyster, Ostra lorida, and eelgrass, Zostera marina. And this living shoreline installation was it was established in 2016 by OC Coastkeeper and Dr. Zacherl at Cal State Fullerton and Dr. Whitcraft at Cal State Long Beach. So it does all of those things that I talked about earlier that living shorelines do. And specifically like these oysters, since they are filter feeders, they improve water quality as well. And so there's just a lot of benefits for these living shorelines. So we, just to show you where it is in Newport Bay. So this is a map of Newport Bay, and the red star kind of shows like the location of Newport Bay, if you're not familiar. I have PCH outlined in white just because it's kind of like a separation between the lower bay and the upper bay. And where I did my research was just in this small part of Upper Newport Bay. So like just now zooming in on that, there were 4 sites where the restoration was installed. And so it wasn't like installed over the entire bay, just at these 4 sites, these 4 green dots. So PCH and Westcliff are 2 sites that are really accessible to the public. And so there's a lot of human interaction with these 2 sites. And this site, De Anza, is kind of behind this like housing tract. So it gets some use, but it's kind of harder to get to. And then over here at Shoemaker, this site is like behind a locked gate that doesn't have any like human interaction really, except for like a few researchers sometimes coming in. But so this is great because there's 4 distinct sites that I used for this research, and I was able to explore how shorebirds interact with these areas. So at each site, there are, you'll see something like this. So here's the shore down here, and you're looking out into the waterline. And these are the different like treatments that were done for the living shoreline. There's the control treatment that had nothing done to it. And it's just like mud flat left how it was. The oyster treatment, which is oysters installed alone. Oyster eelgrass treatment is the oyster and eelgrass installed together. And then the eelgrass treatment is the eelgrass installed alone. And basically the different treatments of restoration were put in place to kind of understand the effectiveness of like the different treatments independently, but as like also as well as together. So that's why they did the restoration like that. But kind of for the purpose of this study, I sort of like focus on what is restored, like these 3 areas, and then what is unrestored, the control. So yeah, like I said, like the goal of my project was to determine how shorebirds use the restored and unrestored treatments and how that usage might differ. There are kind of 3 ideas or schools of thought about how shorebirds might interact with a restored shoreline. So the first idea is that the restoration negatively impacts birds because it decreases the mud flat that the birds use to forage. So the oyster and eelgrass, they're physically blocking the mud flat, and so that would negatively impact those birds because they no longer have that area to forage on. The second idea is that the restoration just won't really make a difference, and the amount of food and everything would stay the same. And then the third idea is that the restoration will actually positively impact birds because those oysters and eelgrass, they create a habitat for invertebrate creatures. And so all of those creatures will be able to, or like the birds will be able to prey on all those extra invertebrates that we just created all that habitat. So that was actually my hypothesis, that the restored oyster and eelgrass beds would result in higher shorebird richness, which is just like the different species of birds, and then abundance, so like higher numbers compared to the unrestored control. So what I did bird surveys between the months of November 2020 to March 2021. I surveyed during low tide, negative 0.5 feet or lower. That's when the restoration had, like the oyster and eelgrass beds were exposed or mostly exposed. Surveyed only during daylight hours. And I did 4 scan samples at each site every day that I went out. So I recorded the bird species and number. I collected the data, whether they were on the control plot or the eelgrass plot or the oyster eelgrass plot, etc. And then, like I said, I did 4 scan samples. So I spaced them out every 15 minutes and then calculated like a daily average for that day, for that site. So this is a picture of some willets and dowitchers. These ones are dowitchers right here, and these ones are willets, foraging on some eelgrass habitat. And I just wanted to show you this because this was like a very common occurrence to see this many birds out there interacting with the restored habitat in Upper Newport Bay. But there weren't just birds using the bay, which makes it kind of a challenging and, dynamic, changing system to describe. So here's fishermen, photographers, dogs, all also using the bay, which obviously influence where a shorebird might be. And on top of that, like there isn't like one single factor that can predict the shorebird usage. So like I said, the human disturbance, there's temporal changes in eelgrass. So right here you can see like the eelgrass was really lush and green when we first started doing our surveys, but that dies back also like during later in the winter. Oysters get redistributed by wave energy, by people, by birds themselves. There's different sediment types at different sites, and different birds have different foraging strategies. So there's a lot of stuff that makes this system like challenging to describe, but I mean, I still tried to do it anyways. Just wanted to show you some like general stats of my research. So during the months of November to March, I did 55 surveys. 17 were at De Anza, 15 were at Shellmaker, 12 at PCH, and 11 at Westcliff. I observed 28 different species of birds, and that made up to approximately 1,700 individual occurrences. So we saw a ton of birds out there. It was really fun and challenging to learn these birds because they all looked the same to me at first. And it was kind of fun over those 5 months to like see myself sort of becoming more of an expert, I guess you could say, at identifying these birds. So the 5 most numerous ones that we saw were the western sandpiper here, the willet, the marbled godwit, the least sandpiper, and the semi-palmated plover. I want to show you some of the data that I collected. So here, down here on the x-axis is the sites, De Anza, PCH, Shellmaker, and Westcliff. And then here are the mean total number of birds. And the 4 colors represent the 4 treatments that I talked about. And the error bars are standard error, and they just kind of represent like the range of my data. The big picture that I want you to see is that birds are using all the sites and all of the habitats. Also, these red arrows, I wanted to remind you, those were those heavily trafficked, most disturbed sites, PCH and Westcliff. And so you can kind of see like maybe there's a little bit less birds at those 2 sites compared to the other sites. And then when we analyze the data statistically, we found treatment effects at some sites. So for example, there are fewer birds on the oyster treatments at De Anza and PCH. But that wasn't true for Shellmaker or Westcliff. So we also did the same thing for richness. And remember, richness is the number of different species in the area. So again, there is a treatment effect here when we analyze this data statistically, but the effect wasn't like consistent across sites. So PCH had lower richness on oyster and control, but over at Shellmaker, the oyster treatment had the highest richness. So like I said, like that treatment effect wasn't consistent across all of the sites. So far I've talked about the entire like bird community, but I also kind of pulled out specific species that I wanted to talk about as well. So the whimbrel was seen, these pictures are taken, I think, 3 different days, all on foraging on oyster habitat. And it seemed like we saw the whimbrel foraging on the oyster plots like more often than anywhere else. And statistically, that observation actually wasn't supported, but maybe I think if I were to like group the oyster and oyster eelgrass treatments together, then I might be able to get like some statistical significance. But anyways, there was a side effect though. So these whimbrels were seen most often at Shellmaker and De Anza compared to PCH. And then another species of bird I chose to focus on is the semi-palmated plover. So we saw them so often at PCH, but then less often at the other sites. I also analyzed this data statistically and saw that there was significantly more semi-palmated plovers at PCH than at De Anza and Shellmaker. So I just want to remind you like the goals or the hypothesis and stuff of my study. There was those 3 different schools of thought, and I kind of predicted that the shorebirds would use the restored treatments, restored habitat more than the unrestored because there would be like more habitat for invertebrates and stuff. And that actually wasn't necessarily supported by my data. But we still saw tons of birds using and interacting with the restored oyster and eelgrass habitat. So like, for example, here's some sandpipers foraging on oysters. They're kind of hard to see, but that's sort of the point, I think. Like, they're really well camouflaged on these oysters. And then also marbled godwit and willet, just waiting for that oyster bed to be exposed by the low tide so that they can like start foraging on those oysters. So yeah, there's tons of birds out there using the habitat, which is super cool to see. So yeah, shorebirds are using the restored areas. Some birds seem to select by treatment, like the whimbrel on oyster, while other birds seem to select by site, like the semi-palmated plover at PCH and the whimbrel at Shellmaker. And the really cool takeaway from this is that the habitat restoration does not impede bird use of mudflats. And also having a mix of habitats is important since no like single habitat type was ideal for the entire bird community. It's a good positive management implication to know these things when we go on and restore or want to restore other sites, that like birds will be able to use this habitat and not be like negatively impacted by it. I still have a lot of questions and work to do though. So I want to like kind of describe these patterns that I've showed you using food availability as like a predictor. So we have these invertebrate samples that Dr. Whitcraft at Cal State Long Beach took, like core samples. And I want to use that data to try to like draw comparisons to like where we saw shorebirds. And then you can even take that a step further, because if you classify a bird's foraging strategy, then you can understand more like what type of invertebrates they will target, and then also understand like where, like what habitat types like they might prefer to use to forage on. Another question that I have is, how has bird use changed over time? So there were prior bird surveys done in 2016 when all of this restoration was being completed. And I'm still going to like look over that data as well and compare it to now to just try to see like how things have changed over time. So like Kirsten said, this is like ongoing research. It's still like in the process of, trying to figure things out. But I just want to thank Dr. Hoese and Dr. Zacherl, and then some students that helped me out with the surveys, Mark, Maddy, Megan, Sydney, Lisa, and Nicolina, Dr. Whitcraft, staff at OC Coastkeeper, including Katie Nichols, Cal State Fullerton Biology Department, and SCERP for funding the research. I was kind of a brief talk, and I probably talked sort of fast because I was nervous, but now I just want to open up to any questions that you guys might have.
Hi, this is Jessica. I just have a quick question. Why did you choose those two birds to focus on in your, when you kind of narrowed down your focus?
Yeah, so those were the ones that were really like obvious to me going out, throughout the months. I would just notice like I was always seeing wimbrels on oyster. And so then I just kind of decided to like look into that more. And then the same for the semi-palmated plover. It seems like we always saw them at PCH, like every time almost, I think. And why weren't they at other sites? So that was like another question that I was like trying to look into and see. That, there's still a lot to learn about why, but definitely those patterns are there.
Have you noticed any new birds at the sites that you didn't really see before the restoration?
So, like I said, there's still a lot of work to be done, and my knowledge of that 2016 data is pretty limited. I didn't do those surveys, and basically I haven't like gone over it just because of like the lack of time and I graduated. So I cannot say if there's like a different bird community in the past versus now. And that's something like I really want to know. I just have to look at the data.
Kim, are you raising your hand? I haven't seen that feature before. I've never actually seen it in effect. Is that what that is?
Yeah, I was raising my hand.
Okay, go for it. I've just never seen how that like actually appears in Zoom. So you learn something new every day.
I find it fascinating, and I'm so glad that you're doing such good work out there. I am curious also about the possibility of restoring the Wintersburg Channel that leads into Bolsa Chica, because I've noticed there are so many birds that are trying to exist there, and there's really nothing there for them. Is there any chance? I mean, I don't know, I guess it's owned by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Maddy, I can answer that if you're not familiar with.
Yeah, I can't really speak to that. I'm not sure.
So the Wintersburg Channel is actually a county storm channel meant to kind of control the flow of storm water. So the thing is, we always see the part that's right at Bolsa Chica, it's right by the tide gates, it's right by the pocket loop, it's by the restored tidal basin. The problem is that storm channel is very long. It reaches all the way back into Anaheim, even back by Disneyland. So it flows over many, many, many miles. And through those many, many, many miles, it accumulates a lot of junk, both physical and tangible, and what we can't see. So my guess, obviously I don't know all the answers, I don't know if there's been any research done on this, but my guess would be that the habitat may not be the best for eelgrass. I know we do get some oysters there, but it may not be the best for eelgrass just because of some of the crud we get, the water, whether it's, I found a bottle of fabric softener once
No, I know you're right. I mean, I see that they've put up nets, near
Yes.
PCH to try to block it. But I've also seen like some, I don't know, they look like bulrush cattails. And I know that filters, but even if it's a long channel, it just seems like it would be better to put those cattails, the bulrushes further up with the nets. So by the time it gets down here to Bolsa Chica, it's going to be a lot cleaner. It just, it just seems like the least we can do.
There's a very viable possibility, but it's hard to say for sure because the channel looks so different in different parts of its stretch. So,
Yeah,
there are some parts that it's entirely concrete
yeah,
and there's not much we can do there because
right.
concrete.
Yeah, but I mean,
Um,
the places that we can, it seems like we should, don't you think? I mean, it just seems
Yeah.
like,
I mean, it
I'm
could have
willing
a
to
trickle
work
down
on it.
effect.
Pardon?
It could have a trickle down effect because if that could get established and that is something that is viable, then it could ultimately help keep the wetlands a little cleaner too because of that extra input. Though most years, especially right now, because we've been in a La Nina for a couple of years now, or 1 or 2 years, and they're forecasting another La Nina this coming winter. When we don't get a whole lot of rain, there's not a whole lot of input from the channel going into the wetlands. It's usually the other way around.
I see.
So that could be why some of those, Jeanette told me to refer them as peeps, the little hard to identify sandpipers because they all look similar. That may be why some of those birds are feeding in that area because there's a lot of stuff coming from the wetlands that's getting pushed through those tidal culverts and ending up in the Wintersburg Channel. But like I said, it's hard to say for sure. I don't know everything about the Wintersburg Channel, and I don't know if there's been any research done about the habitat in there. So it's hard to say for sure.
Well, I guess, Maddie, that's another place you can figure out to save.
Yeah.
Now, did
absolutely.
you do the restoration of the oysters and eelgrass?
No, this actually happened before I even got to Cal State Fullerton. It was done by OC Coastkeeper. Primarily, they were doing the installation, and then it's also been monitored since then by Dr. Zacherl, who's faculty at Cal State Fullerton, and then Dr. Whitcraft, who's faculty at Cal State Long Beach.
And fun fact, if you guys are familiar with our organization, Christine Whitcraft is actually one of our board members. We work with her a
Nice.
lot. She comes and does tours with us, and we actually have her like soft confirmed to do an expert talk next year. So we love Dr. Whitcraft. She's
Nice.
awesome.
Great.
Now, I just have a question about those 4 sites. At each of those sites, you had all 4 control, oyster,
Correct.
eel, and oyster eel. Okay.
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay. It looked like that, but I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
right. And sure.
Now go ahead. What are you going to say?
That those different treatments were basically just to understand like how the were the oysters or the so there's a lot of, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a lot of like research that goes along with the effectiveness of that restoration, how much sedimentation is actually getting deposited to prevent that erosion. And so they're doing experiments and trying to understand how, well, is it the oysters that do the best or the eelgrass that's doing it the best, or both of them together? Is that better? That's why there's like those different treatments.
Nice.
Any other questions? You can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can type them in the chat and I can read them aloud as well.
Yeah, I just wonder if there was any other, if they're going to be rolling this living shoreline out anywhere else along the coast, or does it already exist?
That's a great question. I wish that I knew more. Unfortunately, like I'm not in like any type of role that I'm like talking about doing this at other places, or even know where else it has been done. It's a great question that I should definitely look into for future
Eric, I would guess that there's probably some hope and intent to do this elsewhere. Because typically studies like this are done to say, okay, what's going to happen here? And then as they get further into the study, they'll probably look at, okay, can we apply this somewhere else and see if that can help restore some of the coastal wetland areas. So maybe not right this second, but might come further down the line.
Yeah, and it's just good to have this like knowledge base when that does happen, hopefully soon.
Someone asked, in your research, did you see the shorebirds have any significant effect on the coastal the living coastline, living shoreline? So did the birds have any effect on the habitat?
Well, this is just speaking from my personal observation and not like based on any data that I collected, but I did see birds like moving around the oysters, and they're not like those perfect rectangles anymore. Like when they were first installed, they're kind of just like strewn about everywhere on the shore. And you know, that can be from the waves or from other factors as well. But I did see like birds interacting with the oysters as well. So they are changing it, I believe, to a degree. But also I haven't like done any like actual research for that.
Okay.
I have a question, if you don't mind. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
Wonderful talk, Maddy. It's really comprehensive, especially for somebody like me who is biologically ignorant. So thank you very much. But I'm curious because your data is statistically, I would call it inconsistent, I guess, because it seems like the richness is different than the biological mean or than the mean. And so you said that one of the future things you wanted to do was look at the patterns. Do you have any sort of hypotheses or guesses on like what these patterns can be? Because I can't seem to get one from this.
Okay, yeah. So there are sediment data and invertebrate data that I want to investigate and try to draw conclusions about the different patterns that we're seeing. Okay, so for example, the whimbrels foraging on oysters. I would love to look at the invertebrate data that was taken like for the oyster plots and figure out if those invertebrates are like things that whimbrels like to eat, and kind of like just sort of finding those types of patterns, if that makes sense. Thanks for coming, by the way, Derek.
Got it. Amazing talk. I love it.
Okay, any other questions? Curiosities?
Well, I mean, if you have any, you know, there's vernal pools in Fairview Park. So I don't know if you want to do any studies there. I'd be interested. Wherever you do any studies, I'd be interested, you know, around this area.
Where is Fairview Park?
It's in Costa Mesa, right next to Estancia High School on Placentia.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I know you think it'd be on Fairview because it's Fairview, but it's not.
Yeah, you would think, but I don't think the Talbert Marsh in Huntington is actually on Talbert.
No,
So.
yeah, you're right. Right. So what's in a name, right?
Yep.
The difficulty with student research is, you know, I got into this about a year ago as an undergrad, and now I'm graduated. So I'm not doing this as part of like my degree at this point anymore. So do I continue on and, you know, just do it for the value that it could bring for science, or do I, you know, pass it on to another student? And then there's all this, you know, in the transition, things are lost. So it's it's kind of a slow process, and it's sort of difficult to really expand this research as much as I would like to.
Yes, Stu.
Maddy, can you make a couple comments on your observation of the impact of those other things like humans, dogs, bicycled, whatever? Any observations you have? For example, if a dog or a human walks up and the birds disperse, how long does it take them to come back?
Mhm.
Do they leave for days? It does appear that there are some difference in the numbers on the two sites that have a lot more human interaction. So not really data related, just interested in your thoughts or observations on humans.
Yeah, so when we were doing these surveys, especially at Westcliff and PCH, it was common for, I'm kind of posted back, like trying to be quiet and not seen, but it's common for people just to be running past or walking past with their dogs off leash. And the birds get scared away, for sure. And, but the good thing was, like, when that person or dog passed, like, the birds would come back like within 15 minutes. That was kind of like the average range that I would see. And that's kind of why I chose to do my different scan samples every 15 minutes. So it's definitely an impact on them, but I wouldn't say that it's like so terrible that we shouldn't let anyone use the bay or something like that. Like, the birds they're able to like come back and be reacclimated. And from my perspective, at least, they seem to be doing all right.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, because that's the big question, right? Is how do you balance man and nature, so to speak? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a topic of conversation for Bolsa Chica currently, because we've seen a major uptick in usage and has also seen an uptick in reserve violations, but that's another conversation.
Oh yeah, it's huge,
And I don't know if anybody in this area didn't hear about it, but we did have that tern desertion a few months ago because somebody decided they needed to fly a drone and it crashed near the tern nesting island. Luckily, the least terns didn't seem too bothered by it and they stuck around, but it did cause a few thousand elegant terns to desert their nesting area. And then the poor things went up to Long Beach, and then the chicks were falling off the barge. So they had a rough year. So that's kind of why that question is important. I'm curious, is it an area that is free use, or is there like restrictions on usage of the area? Like, are dogs actually allowed there, or just people bringing their dogs?
It's actually a marine protected area.
Oh, okay.
And I never see any enforcement though. So dogs are off leash, and I've seen collecting, and yeah.
It's hard. There's more properties in Orange County than there are law enforcement in terms of protected areas. So it's tough. Diane, we don't know if the terns are gonna return next year. That's going to be just a kind of, and Jeanette, since you know more about this stuff, you can chime in at any point if you have anything to add. We don't know for sure if the terns are going to come back. That's kind of going to be a waiting game to wait until breeding season starts next year and see if they do decide to come back. I think at this point, there's equal chance that they will, with equal chance that they may not. So we've been historically one of the largest nesting colonies for this bird at Bolsa Chica. So it's entirely possible that they could come back, but it's hard to know for sure until the birds actually come back. So that's not something we'll know until breeding season begins next year. I know that that's not a great answer, but we don't know yet. Okay, any other questions, concerns, curiosities, etc.? Oh, hello. Okay, Maddy, you may or may not know the answer to this. Why the lack of remote sensing to track coastal erosion before and after this natural addition?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, wow, I'm stumped. I don't really know what kind of remote sensing would be used for that.
In addition, would you allow to track how big the eelgrass was and how much area it covered? Drone studies would also add backup data to your manual bird count. Just curious why the lack of GIS remote sensing to enhance the data.
Probably, like budget limitations.
That would be my guess,
It
honestly.
was really cheap for me to just go out there with my binoculars and write down the birds that I saw. But this is like, this is getting more like a PhD project or something.
Well, I mean, I've helped with master's and PhD studies where you have to get the depth of water in Mission Bay. And, we went out on a boat and we throw it's called a Secchi disc. It's a round disc and it's got 2 black shapes and 2 white shapes. I don't know what the general shape, maybe a trapezoid. And you drop it in and then you let it go down until you can't see it anymore. And that's how you estimate the depth. There's usually markers on the rope, the line that you drop it in with. So I think remote sensing is really great for certain things, but there's also budget limitations. Maybe they may not have access to that. But also sometimes I think scientists just prefer to do it the hard way. I've helped with so many marine studies that it's just like, yep, we're gonna ride this boat over here and then sit and wait for half an hour for our next collection period and do all our collection and motor off. So my guess would be funding. Maybe it just didn't occur to them.
Or maybe they would have to consider it as another variable of the study and they didn't want to, because I mean, here we are talking about drones. I know research drones are supposed to be quieter, but still that would have to be included in the study. What impact do they have?
Mhm.
That's just one more human impact,
That's a really good point.
I know right now in Fairview Park, something's coming before the city council next September 21st, whether or not to allow RC planes and back into Fairview Park. And so it's a big deal.
Yeah, I'm sure that maybe they don't have, I mean, I don't know what the funding for Fullerton's science programs are like, but maybe they just don't have access to a research drone. There's probably a short answer, Luke, is we don't know, but there's probably a few factors that worked into it.
I'm glad you just sat there, Maddy, though.
That's the fun thing. Everybody is like, oh, scientific research, it's so glamorous. And you're like, no, I'm sitting here freezing.
Right.
Yeah, it was a couple of days that it was raining and
yeah,
I was just sitting there in the mud.
I've been, like I said, I've helped with marine research where it's like 5 a.m. I'm sitting on a boat in Mission Bay. It's cold. You're pulling equipment out of the water, so you're getting wet. You don't get cell service, so in some places, so you're just sitting there like, oh, this is so much fun. But it can be fun, and it is obviously invaluable for a lot of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other questions, curiosities, etc., etc.? If not, hopefully we'll see you next time and have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, and thank you, Maddy. I don't know how I glazed
It's
over that
okay.
part.
Thank you, Maddy.